I went to the corner, my friends, they weren't there. They said, hey man, you want your share? I turned around and walked away. I didn't want to live nowhere. Street corners with the finest of youth.
Hey there, Douglas Scott McCarron again. So I'm about to reveal another part of my life. Also has big impact on movie making and the story making that we go through. You know, the various mythologies and ways of looking at the world and hallucinogenic beliefs about things. I use the word hallucinogenic because I'm going to talk about LSD right now. When I was a kid, I felt very dark and vindictive and unloved and unloving. And what was it? I was attending college in Europe, and there was one of our professors was a philosophy professor. I'd never taken a philosophy class before, but it was on linguistics and how it affects the way you think. So the professor walks in and says, "Study of linguistics." I'm not going to tell you his name because he eventually gives me LSD, and I'm not going to, talk about him. Of course, it was 40 years ago. Maybe he's dead by now. But walks in, puts down his book, says, I'm blah, 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 blah. This is the class. I want people who are really interested. So if you're not really interested, leave, put your name on this piece of paper, and I'll give you a C and you'll get a credit. So, we're all kind of looking at each other, and about a third of the class gets up and signs this thing and leaves. And they all got C's. Man of his word. And then he sits down and he says, that's 5 minutes. And he sits down and starts describing, I believe it was an Austrian soldier got captured during World War I, and he ended up in prison, and he started, he didn't have anything else to do besides sit in this hole, started thinking about language and how it dictates and influences the way we think. But we all have the language we speak. We assume that is the describer of life. It's the real thing. I live in the United States. We speak American English, which is not as flowery and in depth as the English that's spoke, say, in Great Britain, because they have more of a cultural background to it. But, we have past, present, future. There are languages that have like several more time tenses. Now, I as an American sit there and go, what the heck could that be? These countries that have several more time tenses, their speakers and thinkers think on a different level than the people in the United States do. I know very little Russian. People have this, especially in the West, have this historical assumption that Russians are kind of like dumb and Slavs and blah, blah, blah. And they have this nasty way of solving scientific problems. And a lot of them are actually fairly smart people. They can be kind of rough people. The ones I've known are fairly loudmouthed and and they like to drink and talk and be real loud. But you get into a philosophical discussion with them and it's like, oh, holy crap, I better not talk too much here. So, different cultures have different words, different ways of forming the understanding of what's going on. And that gives you your way of seeing the world, but it also limits your way of seeing the world. So he talks about this. This guy did this study. He talked about how the language built everything up, the flow of, from the Indus into Western Europe, and there's this construction of language. And apparently, Western language is somewhat associated to coming out of India. I don't know, I wasn't around when it happened. I just believe people told me this. The Arabs showed up. The Arabs' language is all very calligraphy, very beautiful to look at. Don't understand a word of it, but it looks very beautiful, and it apparently imparts things that just aren't even present in English. I know in Germany, like, for instance, the word "the glory of God" in English in America is just the glory of God. In Germany, the word is like this, for glory is just sort of like this pulsating, shining orb that breathes life. That's the word they use. The word in English in America doesn't have that. It's just the glory of God. But, we then take that and then we assign the meaning we have to the word, and then out of us comes all this feeling and emotion and belief. And we act like that's what's being talked about in the Bible and things like that. And it's just us projecting our internal thing. I'm not saying the Bible isn't real. I'm just saying when you read it and you make up all these stories about it, it's you projecting. I have people, they'll read the Old Testament and reference it to the United States and what we're doing to fulfill the prophecies of the Torah. I study theology. I don't recall the United States being mentioned in the Torah. But, people are worshiping themselves, not God. Anyway, so the guy goes through this whole thing. It's a 3-hour class. At the end of an hour and a half, he's explained how this guy did the whole thing. He's given everybody C's. He's explained how it all works with the culture, and then, the culture and defines everything. And then he sits down and says, okay, that's what I have to say. Now, this semester was 16 weeks long, 3 hours each week. And the guy just spent an hour and a half on it and defined the whole thing. What are we going to do for the next 15 weeks and hour and a half? And we're all just kind of like looking around at each other like, who the hell is this guy? And he says, well, that's it. What else do you want to talk about? And this one kid, he was a son of a naval officer. He says, are you for real? Are you joking? He says, oh man, I'm totally serious. This is my life. This is my life force. I spent an hour driving over here. I spent 10 hours getting prepared for this thing to explain it to you. That's my life force that was spent. This is the only life I've got. I mean this absolutely, totally. Do you? And we're all kind of looking at each other and I'm like, oh, cool. Maybe somebody's going to talk to us honestly for once in college. So we went through the whole course, and it basically became a 15-hour discussion on what does it mean to be alive and what does it mean to perceive, and how does language help us perceive and yet prevent us from perceiving. I found it all very interesting. Course gets all done. I stayed through it, so instead of a C, I got a B. Yeah. A couple of weeks later, a guy I know at school comes by and says he's going to drive over to meet the professor. And I'm like, oh. And I go along and says, well, I really shouldn't. And my friend was kind of staying alive by dealing drugs. He's like, well, I shouldn't. It might cause troubles. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, well, he's kind of my supplier. And I'm like, my philosophy professor is your supplier? He says, well, of LSD. And I'm like, LSD? I've heard of this. In the 60s and 70s, you keep hearing these stories about becoming one with the universe and being happy and peaceful. But there's also stories about Charlie Manson and the family getting on LSD and murdering people. But I've later since learned that it was actually, they were on a form of speed. And there are a lot of other things going on. But, in the common culture, psychotic hippies on LSD running around naked in the woods and peace, love, and on and on. I mean, all those crazy things like living peacefully with your neighbors and don't kill each other and let's have sex with each other. Of course, there were other hippies that lived on farms and they were absolutely celibate, supposedly. Never know. But anyway, so I'm like, my professor sells LSD. Well, can I go along anyway? I don't know why I wanted to, but it's one of these things. So we get in the car and my friend drives us over there, and I get out and I walk in and he's not there. There's like 4 or 5 people there, and there's pictures of these like yogis on a table, like a little shrine, and there's like a couple of mats on the floor, and it's just very sparse. And I'm like, well, what's all this then? And I turned around, I looked at it, and there was this, really odd looking curtain that covered the whole window. And until I realized it wasn't a curtain, it was a bunch of marijuana and plants. And I'm like, oh, what's this here? Before this, I smoked some hashish, which is kind of the thing they smoked in Europe. Marijuana wasn't as big, and that had been kind of a trip, but the guy who was giving it to me was on this whole, I'm going to teach you how to, open your narrow mind to perceive things. And I kind of resented that. It's true I had a narrow mind, but I didn't want anybody sitting around assuming they're the ones who are going to open my brain up. I crave the affection and attention and approval of others, but I'm sure not going to let you give it to me. Kind of the way it was. Anyway, we're there. And one of the guys who were there is starts talking about LSD and how it can open you up. And I said, open you up to what? And he goes, God. And he kind of looks around with his eyes like this. And I'm like, interesting. I've heard of this. And I remembered, I think I've told you my mom's suicide. I had this big thing come in and start talking to me. So he says, do you want to try some? And I'm like, no, it's Friday night. What else have I got going on? Wasn't exactly what I said, but that was the attitude. So he gives me this orange tablet, and I stick it in my mouth and told me to just swallow it. And I'm sitting there, and then the philosophy professor comes back. And we start talking, and I'm like, who are these weirdos in the photos? And the yogis, and he tells me who they are. And it was a particular religious group, and they were followers of it. So they said, I've actually met this group, and I don't recall them being big on people taking LSD. I think probably what happened is a bunch of people took LSD, and then they read the books. And they're like, oh, yeah, we agree with this. But anyway, they're doing this religious thing. So I take this LSD, and I'm starting to just... The thing about LSD is it takes about an hour to take off. I felt like I'd failed, I'd done something wrong. And then all of a sudden, it was just like this rocket just went... And I'm just like, whoa. And I'm staring around, and my pupils are massively big, and everything everybody's saying to me doesn't mean anything. And the professor's explaining to me now that, supposedly my mind was open, he could talk to me. And I'm just sitting there kind of going, oh, blah, blah, blah. So they want to meditate, and I'm sitting there kind of in the middle of the floor, just that's not going to help. So they took me into this room, and they put the dog in there with me. Professor had a dog, and I'm sitting there just watching the walls kind of pulsate, and there was a wood floor, but it looked like it was slithering, I think I understand what happened there is the reason why human beings have 3-dimensional sight is there are these little muscles that jerk your eyeballs around, and so you're constantly getting this redefinition of what's going on, and your brain assembles it as having depth. On LSD, you pick up all those little jerks. And so, you see these little jerks, you look down at the wood grain of the floor, and the grain, because my eyes are jerking around, is going, and the walls are kind of, And I'm like, geez, this is intense. And then I'm just sitting there, and the dog comes over to me, and I can reach out to pet it, and I'm high as a kite. And this dog grabs my leg and starts humping away at my leg. And I'm like, I don't like this. So I kick it away, and it runs by, and keep kicking it away. It goes on for about 15 minutes. So I crawl up on top of the refrigerator. I don't know how the hell I got up on top of a 5 foot tall refrigerator, but I did. And the dog's like jumping up, trying to jump up at me and hump my leg more. And this goes on some undeterminate time, because on LSD, time's indeterminate. And after a while, the professor came in, and he's like, "Oh, what's going on?" I'm like, and he sees the dog's erection. He's like, "Oh, I get it. Okay." Throws the dog out of the room, closes the door, and proceeds to like discuss reality with me. And I'm like, wow. And all the beards on his face are like, and his glasses are like, But the thing that was really weird in the middle of all this was this calm ecstaticness. And I could kind of get, he's talking about connecting with God and the one and source. It's kind of how I felt. I also felt panicked and upset and scared, but there was this deep inner core that felt very calm and peaceful. Somewhat like I do now, but very different. It had this very, the only word I can put is electric, or shall we say chemically unbalanced feeling to it. It was just kind of So he goes out and walks out, and for some reason I decide it's time to leave. And I come out in the living room, and nobody's there. I don't know where they are, but my friend is gone. I don't have a ride home. There's nobody in the house. So I leave. And I get outside and I start walking, and somehow I figured out what was the right direction to walk home, 7 miles away. So I start walking along, checking out the unity of the universe, and looking at the lay of the land, and hearing growling animals everywhere. Who knows what's going on, if any of this is really happening. Car comes out of the village where I lived, and you can see the headlights going back and forth in the sky as it's going along these corners. And all of a sudden it comes around the corner, and all these headlights hit my eyes, and I'm like, ah! And I fall down and into the side of the road, into the drain thing. And then I feel something crawling on my leg, and I get up and I start beating the tar out of it. And yet I thought it was all really funny. So I keep walking home, and in a matter of minutes or hours, seeing as it was several miles, but to me it was a few minutes, I get back to the village, and I stop, and the whole world is like, and I look down, and I'm standing on the weight scale. There's this place where they would weigh trucks that were in transit, and it's kind of floating around like, oh, okay. So I have an explanation, because it's important to have an explanation. And I walk home, and I crawl in bed, and I stare at the ceiling until not the morning, but the morning after that. But Sunday, so I didn't miss any class. And that was my introduction to LSD. I probably did it, I know I did it over 100 times over the course of about 10 years. I can go on and on with all these stories, but eventually I just kind of got to the point where, okay, well, I have this ecstasy, and it's all happy and everything, but that doesn't seem to be doing anything new. Nothing new happened. I did seem to be getting more and more detached from being a normal human, which was good and bad, because I was getting detached from my internal story. I actually had the experience of stuff that was not of my thoughts. It was like very quiet. There's one time I stared up at the sky and all the stars, and it felt like something in me jumped up into the heavens, and you just felt this eternal flow of endlessness. But after a while, I kind of went, well, all I'm really doing now is burning my nerve endings or something. And I decided to stop. I did it a couple more times a few years later, at which point I felt very nauseous taking it. Literally, the last time I took it, somebody put a tab in my hand, and my body just went, "Bleh," like threw it away. Because, like, apparently the LSD is water soluble. It hit the sweat in my hand, and it went into my pores, and my body, this is the way I understood it, instantly recognized what it was and went, "Bleh." So it gave me a lot of. I had a friend say this once, and I think it's really true. It gave me a lot of spiritual experiences, but I don't know that it actually gave me any spiritual insight. It let me build a different story, a different way of understanding the story that was going on. But it didn't really like change anything, because I still had the same basic understanding, still the same belief that there was something that needed to be fixed, something to be understood. And again, I've said this in other places. I think that's kind of how the cocoon keeps you ensnared in it. It keeps convincing you that if you have the right explanation, then something dramatic will happen. But all that happens is you keep getting more explanations. And they're all happening in this personality that isn't you, in this name that isn't you, which just keeps you bound to that thing too. So, I don't know how good it was for me. The one thing I do know is I was dark and miserable and vindictive and self-loathing. And on LSD, I felt ecstatic and peaceful and loved. And I think that probably saved me, because I didn't know how to get there, but this chemical showed me it was in me. And that's probably why I took it so many times, is I kept trying to get back to that feeling. But for a permanent change, who knows? I've done all these things, so who knows how this would have worked. But therapy, landmark forum, all these things, meditation, they actually produced the pathway of getting out of feeling unloved and unwanted and all the stuff that had always run my life. So I don't know that, I can't say that I'm mad or sad that I took it, but outside of providing me the awareness that it was possible to actually feel loved and to love, I'm not really sure that it had any great insight for me. A lot of spiritual sort of type experiences, all sorts of fantastic hallucinatory stuff going on, but as far as actually really changing me, I think you need to be straight to do that. Besides, taking drugs to kind of blast you out of your normal way of looking at things operates on the theory that the normal way of looking at things is the right way. It was like I was trying to have my own personal therapy session with myself without actually really changing. It wasn't until I dealt with being dark and miserable and needing external validation and being able to handle rejection and not get all upset about how much I sucked. It wasn't until all that got handled that I really started changing. And that didn't come out of LSD. The thing about the pillars of intents and the way I visualize things, that may have come out of LSD. I don't know. I've actually described that pillar of intent to a couple of people, and they're like, They don't see it quite that way, but they recognize it. Anyway, if you're taking a bunch of drugs or drinking a lot of alcohol and self-medicating, I highly encourage you to stop that. First off, you'll save a bunch of money. Stop smoking, stop drinking, stop drugging. It sounds like, bad boy, don't do that. But, that kind of came out for me, at least, people wagging their finger at me, you're wrong, I'm right, I'm going to do it my way, you're not going to tell me what to do. Again, that's all child and teenager sort of mindset. And unless you take that on, nothing changes. I'm paraphrasing, but the wise philosopher Craig Ferguson said something to the effect of, nothing changes unless you change it. If you don't start changing things for real, you just keep doing the same thing and self-medicating until something falls apart on you. And there's no need for that. Because you can get the healing and the love and the compassion and the feeling of self-love and fill the hole in. Again, I like to use the words. They're out of landmark, but I just really dig them. Whole, perfect, and complete. Okay, till the next one. Douglas Scott McCarron signing off. Bye.